Hello, History 17B Spring Quarter 2024. In part one of this lecture, Lecture 13, we looked at efforts of the white middle class to make merit the criterion for getting civil service jobs. In this, they succeeded, and it was better than the spoils system, at least in theory, but the test still favored those who got a particular type of education by virtue of their position in society. Poor people could and did take and pass the exam, but preparation required greater relative expense for them. We also looked at the section of the white middle class whose ideas of a stable society rested on their own version of middle class morality, particularly when it came to family and gender roles. This basically put the onus on the poor to act like the white middle class, whether such a demand were reasonable or even possible. And finally, we saw members of the white middle class use the power of newspapers combined with investigative journalism to try to bring awareness of the rest of the white middle class to the realities of life for the working classes. That is a lot of white middle class. Why spend so much time on them? During the time period of Module C, the middle class became a powerful voting bloc, and they had quite diverse and often conflicting views on what would count as progress in the now gigantic, in many ways, United States. Not only did the federal government, including the Senate and House of Representatives, get bigger during this period, but it became a greater and greater challenge for political hopefuls to figure out what would get a big enough chunk of the white middle class vote to propel them successfully into office. We will return to that in the next lecture. In this last section of Lecture 13, we will look at ways the middle class, including both the white middle class and Black middle class, sought to change conditions for the poor, and not just change poor people themselves, although that was always still there. I am going to start off this section on laws by saying that although federal laws end up making the usual list of progressive reforms in general American history coverage, like textbooks, these were limited, often not well designed or implemented from the perspective of the working classes, and in many cases were completely lacking. The laws that most discussions of progressive reform at the national level will point to are the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act, both passed in 1906. You have seen and heard about Upton Sinclair's Jungle a couple of times now, including in the muckraker section in part one of this lecture. You have actually seen this meatpacking picture there as well, the one on the slide, but I've made it bigger so you can see both what these people are doing, stuffing sausage into casings and tying them off by hand, and also that most of these are children. The man in the middle of the photo is probably the only one over the age of 18. The rest range from around 9 to probably around 17 years old. You can see the two little guys on the left here are wearing scarves and beanies. The packing had to be done in the cold so that the meat would not spoil before all of it was made into sausages. Upton Sinclair, the author of The Jungle, was a dedicated socialist, and he had written the book hoping to get the white middle class to press for reforms in factory conditions and pay. Instead, the voting and politician pressuring public focused on the few pages that described in truly disgusting detail the unsanitary conditions in which commercial meat was processed. He meant his readers to sympathize with workers when he described men losing fingers in grinding machines or dying when they fell into lard rendering vats. Some historians have noted that the white middle class seemed more concerned that there was immigrant in their sausages than they were with the plight of the immigrants themselves. Upton Sinclair himself famously commented, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." While food safety laws absolutely were a good thing, they stopped far short of addressing the more fundamental issues in the workplace. The white middle class was defined and exclusionary, largely based on education, money, and family structure. Because of severe segregation, often combined with outright violence, including the destruction of entire Black neighborhoods by white mobs, the Black middle class was defined largely by education. Black Americans were admitted to very few institutions of higher learning run by white people. Oberlin College in Ohio is a notable exception to that and accepted people on equal terms. The creation of what are now called HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities, had begun in the mid-19th century. But you can see that Black Americans founded many colleges throughout the time periods of modules B and C. Most of these are in southern states, and you can see that many were founded before the end of Reconstruction. I've highlighted some of the more famous schools throughout: Fisk University, Howard, Spelman, Tuskegee, and Bethune-Cookman. The point here is that the educated Black middle class was not just a handful of people. It was not as powerful a voting bloc as the white middle class, but there were a substantial number of highly educated Black Americans. To forget this is to accept the racist narrative that segregationists and white mobs intended to produce, that Black Americans represented an uneducated underclass. Despite the virulence of racism they faced, Black Americans actively sought out education at all levels. You are looking at Howard University here, which was founded in 1867. Circling back to pressure on the federal government, this is Ida B. Wells, later Wells Barnett, who wrote in newspapers and pamphlets, as well as giving speaking tours in both Europe and the US. We met her first way back in lecture 4 with her text, Red Record. Wells was active in women's suffrage and other causes of the time, but most of her energy was focused on a strong anti-lynching campaign. I have seen Wells included under muckrakers in a few places, and in the sense that she used newspapers to try to raise awareness and pressure the federal government, she fits. I have separated her from the muckrakers, however, for one, and to me, incredibly strong reason. Other muckrakers could walk away from the issues that they covered and be safe, ordinary white middle class people. Wells did not have that privilege. This newspaper article, Driven from Home, it appeared in the Washington Bee in 1892. The first paragraph says, in part, "The fearless spirit of Ida B. Wells, editor of the Memphis Free Speech, has been spoken of in these columns and her bravery commended. Among all civilized people, courage commends itself to brave people, but among barbarians of the Memphis stripe, her courage was a menace. So these brave, chivalrous Southern people made up their minds to drive this plucky little woman out of town." Notice also that what is happening here in this article is something that Ida B. Wells herself did, which is to turn around the discourse of civilization and point out that it was white Southerners and Northerners who were acting like barbarians, violent barbarians, and that this is neither brave nor chivalrous. Ida B. Wells had lost friends to lynching. There were very few Black Americans in the South who had not lost someone to lynching. In 1895, Wells said, "The facts have been so distorted that the people in the North and elsewhere do not realize the extent of the lynchings in the South. I think that many of us still have trouble getting our heads around how something so patently evil could be practiced out in the open without shame to such a terrible extent. We are talking about people totaling in the thousands who were murdered on a regular basis. It seems like a no-brainer that one of the progressive era US governments would pass a law at the federal level banning lynching, and yet that never happened. I am going to expand past the Module C time period just for this slide. I will read it because I know that it's small. These actions are grouped between 1882 and 1968. That's not a typo, folks. 1968. Nearly 200 anti-lynching bills were introduced in Congress. Not one of them passed. Between 1890 and 1952, 7 US presidents asked Congress to pass a federal anti-lynching law. It never happened. This is another group. Notice where we are in time now. This is more than a decade into the 20th century. In April of 1918, the Dyer anti-lynching bill was first introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives by Missouri Republican Leonidas C. Dyer, hence the name. The bill failed in the Senate. In 1920, introduced again the Dyer anti-lynching bill, endorsed by President Harding, filibustered in Senate, so it died. It was introduced again in 1923 and again in 1924, and every time it was defeated. In 1934, we're up to the 1930s now, the Costigan-Wagner bill, co-sponsored by Senators Costigan and Wagner, both Democrats, was introduced. President Franklin D. Roosevelt took too long to sign it. He was concerned about his reelection prospects in 1936, and in fairness, with the Great Depression and World War II coming, but nevertheless, he did the wrong thing and the bill died. In June of 2018, 21st century, almost 2 decades into it, 2018, Victims of Lynching Act put forward by the then 3 African-American members of the U.S. Senate, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Tim Scott. That bill in 2018 died in the House of Representatives. In 2022, a mere 2 years ago, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act passed by the U.S. House of Representatives on February 28th and the U.S. Senate on March 7th, 2022, and it was signed into law by Joe Biden, president. Notice it took until 2022 to make a law that said something as obvious as murder is wrong. You can't do it. Most progressive legislation that directly affected the lives of large groups did not happen at the federal level. But legislative action could be highly effective at the state, municipal, and local government levels. Laws for safe housing, fair business practices, universal child education that we take for granted now, sanitation that we also take for granted now, worker safety, anti-racketeering, and many more spread from location to location. This was spotty and incomplete, but we've also seen that the implementation of even so big a legal intervention as the 14th Amendment faced constant resistance and had only spotty and incomplete success. I find it difficult to focus on bare lists of legislation. It is much easier when there is a concrete example to link my thoughts to. So many stories in history are so profoundly depressing that I am happy to get to share one that, while not perfect, as nothing ever is, certainly represented an improvement in the situation of New York City's working class residents. This is a record of sanitary inquiry in New York City, and each of these little tiny rectangles represents an apartment. On 12 April 1901, the New York State Legislature passed the Tenement House Act of 1901, more commonly known as the New Law or New Tenement Law. This was only possible because of intense pressure by housing reform groups, leading to then Governor Theodore Roosevelt appointing a commission to study the issue of the need to reform existing housing law in New York in 1900, so a year before the act was done. In February 1901, the commission issued a report to the new governor, Benjamin B. Odell Jr. Roosevelt had become vice president at this point. And the report, which came out in 1901, recommended new legislation governing housing safety. The state legislature almost immediately held hearings, and only 2 months after the commission issued its report, which is pretty amazing, really, the Tenement House of 1901 was enacted. So let's look at what that act was dealing with. We have talked about New York tenements when we looked at Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. The earliest tenements were erected before there was any substantial regulation of this type of housing. The first law that governed the actual physical form of tenements in New York City was not passed until 1879 and is known as the Old Law now. Thus, the first wave of tenements erected in New York City prior to the Old Law are called pre-law or pre-Old Law tenements. The typical pre-law tenement was about 4 stories tall, because that was as tall as you could make it at the time, and housed 10 to 20 families on a narrow 25-foot wide lot. And in case you're wondering what that is, this is the width you're looking at here. There were generally 4 units on each of the upper floors, each with a pair of stores and 2 rear apartments on the first floor or ground floor. Each apartment had 2 or 3 rooms, but windows lit only 1 room in each apartment. Thus, most rooms had no immediate access to natural light or fresh air. These apartments were not supplied with gas, which was used for lighting and heating at the time, nor were they supplied with water. Some tenements had a single water line with a tap in the hall on each floor. Most, however, had both the water source and toilets in the shallow backyard. And these are the toilets right here. The result of a campaign by reformers, the Tenement House Law of 1879, so we're still back on the old law here, actually did not greatly improve conditions. This law had no effect on tenements that had already been constructed, nor on row houses that had been converted into tenements. However, the law succeeded in prohibiting the construction of buildings with windowless interior rooms, requiring that all rooms have windows facing the street, rear yard, or an interior air shaft. The most common design resulting from this requirement was the dumbbell shape. So we're looking down from above at this plan, and it's named that because the required air shafts here in white created a building footprint here in gray that resembles the shape of a handheld exercise weight. And you could see 2 actual buildings, well, 3, this one's kind of covered up. And you can see the original air shaft between the buildings in this photograph from above. Unfortunately, the shafts required in the 1879 law were so small that they provided little light and air to apartments below the top floor. Instead, they became receptacles for garbage and created flues that sucked flames from one floor to another. during a fire. And you can see the after effects of a fire here that's been spread that way. In addition, the shacked windows of adjoining apartments were so close that privacy was virtually eliminated. However, notice that there is a shared toilet actually inside the tenement building here. It looks very appealing. And this is also a shared sink for the entire floor, but you don't have to hoist the water up 4 flights of stairs, so there's that. The 1901 or new law mandated that all rooms have windows and each apartment have its own toilet facilities. An important aspect of the law was its impact on older tenement buildings. Couldn't completely remake them, but the law mandated a series of changes designed to address the dangerous and unsanitary conditions in these pre-existing tenements. Changes included improved lighting, banning windowless interior rooms, and requiring the addition of one toilet for every 2 families. In order to provide the required light and air for the 1901 Tenement House Act, new law tenements, unlike their dumbbell predecessors, typically looked like one of the letters H, C, I, or L from above. And you can see that plan here. It looks like an I if you see it vertically. If you look at it this way, it's kind of a squat H. This left a significant amount of open space actually on the lot for things like air. It was this sort of painstakingly pursued local legislation that is less glitzy than national laws, but that really started to make an on-the-ground difference, albeit often small and painfully slow, in working class people's lives. And these are schematics of pre-regulation tenements. You can see there's really no opening at all. And each of these is an apartment right through there. These are the dumbbell old law tenements, and these obviously are the new ones. Settlement houses were homes where middle-class residents lived in the neighborhoods they were trying to help. Most of these residents were middle-class women, but by no means all of them. Residents usually stayed for a time and then moved on to other professional work. Not all settlement houses were equally helpful to the working class folks around them, but good ones could be quite useful. I'm going to talk about the first settlement house in the US, which was in Chicago, and then I'm also going to talk about a settlement house close to us in San Francisco, but there were many, many others. The Hull House building started life as a mansion that was eventually surrounded by tenements. As the wealthy moved out of Chicago's near West Side and immigrants moved in 1889, Jane Addams, on the bottom right here, and Ellen Gates Starr, up above here, bought the dilapidated building and began fixing it up, not just as a home for themselves, but as a pleasant place for the neighboring poor to spend whatever they had in the way of free time. Adams and Starr were college graduates, well-educated and well-traveled, with zero interest in marrying men, and a social conscience that told them they ought to do something, although they weren't quite certain what. We will get to the other woman here, so just glance at her now. Adams and Starr thought in the beginning that they would offer classes in things like art history and music. They were cultured, college-educated women. When they actually arrived, they realized how ignorant and naive they were. But they gamely watched babies for working women and tried to help neighbors deal with unscrupulous landlords and find food. Adams later recalled, quote, "One of the first lessons we learned," meaning she and Starr, "at Hull House was that private beneficence is totally inadequate. to deal with the vast numbers of the city's disinherited. We also quickly came to realize that there are certain types of wretchedness from which every private philanthropy shrinks and which are cared for only in those wards of the county hospital provided for the wrecks of vicious living or in the city's isolation hospital for smallpox. So she is pointing out essentially here the problem with philanthropy. People with sexually transmitted diseases still need help. And philanthropy, which judges people, doesn't do that. Adams would live the rest of her life at Hull House, although Ellen Gates Starr later left and, going back for just a moment, Mary Rosette Smith, the third woman in this image, took Starr's place in Jane Addams' life as well as at Hull House. She, Rosette Smith, like Addams, devoted the rest of her life to the project. Hull House changed the neighborhood, and the neighborhood changed Hull House. This was not gentrification. Addams excelled at getting the wealthy to donate money and the poor to be honest with her about what they wanted. As more residents came to live in Hull House, Addams and her increasing number of college-educated residents, men and women, offered childcare and then kindergarten as well, and then courses in just about anything they were asked for. It turned out the people living in the neighborhood wanted practical help, but they actually wanted the art history lessons as well. I love this picture. It's the Hull House Boy Club's cooking class. And while the picture is clearly staged, the class was very real. For better and for worse, perhaps, Hull House did try to help immigrants to the U.S. Americanize, offering courses in English language, American government, and writing. But when the old neighborhood residents wanted lectures on socialism, Addams hosted a lecture on socialism. When someone in the neighborhood wanted to teach old country embroidery, Addams gave them a classroom and materials. Over the time that Addams lived at Hull House, it turned into a gigantic complex with kitchens, a cafe, the kindergarten, classrooms for art, music, and dance, meeting rooms, a gymnasium, and probably other things that I have forgotten. And just to remind you of what the original Hull House looked like, not so big, pretty much completely swallowed up in this. You can probably guess that Hull House grew to be far more than most other settlement houses. Hull House was special. Union leaders, university professors, lawyers, and politicians lectured or taught at Hull House. And they didn't use Hull House to talk to one another. They talked to the people in the neighborhood. This was not something that Addams could ever have funded on her own, but she had something of a genius for getting the wealthy to contribute while still treating her poor neighbors like actual human beings, like herself. And these are some of the programs. You could see Hull House Social Club, Debating Club, Men's Athletic Class. And in case you're wondering, there were many, many women's athletic classes too. I'll come back and talk about that in the coda briefly. Drawing class, Greek art, arithmetic and geometry, English composition. So those are courses. But then there are also clubs and lectures. The Working People's Social Science Club, lectures on child labor, our jury system, the Chicago Police, labor organization, and competition. There's also the Young Citizens Club and lectures on navigating the Cook County courts, and one called What Can the Law Do for the Poor Man? And down here, there's Latin too. Now, I'm not going to pretend that Addams always did wonderful things and never said things that reflected the prejudices of the society she lived in. She herself was human and coming from an extremely privileged position. But I will say that she listened to people and did not constantly assume that she knew best. And she did a great deal herself. She didn't just tell other people what they should do. For example, when she realized that garbage was never removed from the neighborhood, and this was before Hull House basically took over part of the neighborhood, she went to the city government, got herself appointed garbage inspector for her ward, and made certain that the garbage was collected. One last thing before we leave Hull House. Adams residents were mainly college educated in the era of making everything rational and efficient, like movements of assembly line workers. But the settlement house residents didn't just go to government bodies and say that something needed to be fixed. They collected data. They made maps of where residents came from, where they had immigrated from or migrated from, how much they were paid, where they got their water, and where cases of typhus broke out. They set the standard for social welfare studies for decades, and eventually Hull House was absorbed into the sociology department at the University of Chicago, where it remains. And you can visit it. Much of it's been replaced by the university, but there's a little bit of the original Hull House left. For the second settlement house in this lecture, we have to go back to the Page Law or Page Act of 1875. Depending on what we think the actual purpose of the Page Law was, it was either an abysmal failure or a resounding success. And just a reminder, the Page Law 1875 prohibited the recruitment to the United States of unfree laborers and women for immoral purposes. Now, I didn't say this before. The way that the Page Law was worded did not actually single out the Chinese, but its enforcement almost entirely against Chinese immigrants makes the actual motive clear. Also, the law, as we have seen, did not actually stop mining and other companies from recruiting male workers in China, which is one thing it sounds like it ought to do, right? But it did place the workers so recruited in a precarious social and legal position. Similarly, the Page Law did usually stop Chinese men from bringing female family members to the US when they immigrated, but it did actually less than nothing to stop sex trafficking of Chinese women and girls. In fact, it made these worse. So if the point of the law was truly to protect Chinese women and children, it could hardly have been a greater failure. However, if the point of the Page Law was to create an image of Chinese people as inherently immoral and untrustworthy among white Americans, then the Page Law worked perfectly. Men with greater desire for money than they had scruples about doing harm recognized an opportunity when they saw it, and indeed found that it could become very lucrative for them to bring Chinese women into the western half of the US for sex. Enormous corruption amongst the police force and the San Francisco city government through the latter half of the 19th century, that's during our progressive era, actively helped with this trafficking. Through the 1860s and 70s, Chinese women could literally be sold at auction as soon as they disembarked on the wharf of San Francisco, with no interference from police or those in power in the city. Once the Page Law went into effect, these sales became less visible, but in no way less frequent. And this is the doorway of a brothel here. Going back a year before the Page Law, but when the sex trade was already underway, a group of white religious women founded a house in San Francisco, and you can see what it first looked like there on the left. They intended to help Chinese immigrant women out of slavery. They also intended to convert the women to Christianity and direct them into wholesome marriages with Christian Chinese Americans. This is one of those situations with good intentions, but also with a limited view of what was best for other people. The original house was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake and fire that destroyed much of San Francisco. In the early years of the 20th century, this laser focus on religious conversion would undergo a subtle but meaningful change. Donaldina Cameron, and you see her here, arrived in 1895 as a sewing teacher. Tian Fu Wu, and you see her over here, had arrived a year before Cameron as someone who sought refuge in the house. Wu then went to the elite Stevens School in Philadelphia and got a college degree in Toronto before returning to the house in 1911, becoming Cameron's partner in running the house until their retirements. The two lived close to one another in Palo Alto and remained lifelong friends. The woman in the middle between Cameron on the left and Wu on the right is not identified. And clearly, the house is a new building dating to after earthquake and fire. Under Cameron and Wu, people who lived in the house still had to do chores and go to church, but the house began to do more to draw in publicity and sympathy and to turn the actual daily business of the house over to Chinese, or really now Chinese American women, as opposed to only middle class white women. On the other hand, given the white middle class at the time, Cameron got sympathy and funding by casting Chinese women and girls as entirely helpless. The photo on the left is an actual brothel. The photo on the right is a staged rescue for the newspapers. Remember the yellow sensationalist press? Cameron and Wu down here look on as a policeman rescues a child who has been forced into sex slavery. Her situation was probably quite real. The rescue itself was staged for the photo. We have here the white savior myth, but it was also an extremely successful strategy in getting sympathy that offered very real help to women trapped in the sex trade. And Cameron used her position as an educated white woman to advocate for Chinese women who had been arrested in a way that they were not legally permitted to advocate for themselves. The rescue publicity only reinforced the image of Chinese women as sex workers, just as victims rather than vipers. In reality, most Chinese women at the house weren't rescued by the police. They escaped and made their way to the house under their own power and ingenuity. Now, the house under Cameron and Wu also worked to bring awareness to women who became incredibly successful after making use of the house, trying to combat the helpless sex object myth. At the same time, they were promoting it. Real life is incredibly complicated. The woman driving the car in the photo is Tai Liang, who took refuge at the house. Later, Tai Liang Schultz. She was one of the first Chinese American women to vote in the US. The House did push for women to convert to Christianity. It did try to arrange marriages for them, in part as a form of protection, but also the men had to be Christian. Balancing this out, one of the most remarkable contributions of the home was the ability to keep women hidden and safe without keeping them entirely isolated from the world at large. Many former house residents went on to have professional careers, often as translators. The house offered classes in Chinese as well as in English. One example of a woman who used Cameron House is Bessie Jiang, who became the first Chinese woman to graduate from Stanford in 1927. Jiang recalled saying of her aspirations at the time, quote, "Hey, we're not going to be homemakers. We're going to be career girls. We're not having babies. We're going out in the world and contribute." The image on the right is the only one I could easily find of Dr. Bessie Jiang. And the image on the left is the mission house built after the earthquake and fire. It is now called Cameron House, and you can still visit it in San Francisco. Cameron and Wu chose to be buried side by side, and you can also visit their graves in the Evergreen Cemetery in East Los Angeles. For parts C and D to the good intentions section of lecture 13, I am somewhat artificially separating what was, in fact, a range of groups that often blended into one another, clubs and organizations. Well-to-do men in the US had clubs from early in the 19th century from which women were excluded, and in England they had them even before that. The clubs of the progressive era US were often women's clubs. Some, like the group on an outing here, the Excelsior Club picnic at North Salmon Creek Beach in 1915, some were mainly social clubs. Women used the club structure to organize trips and other events, but it let them go where they wanted to go and have fun safely. Many other clubs centered more around intellectual pursuits. These tended to organize a series of lectures on a variety of topics. Lectures on health and anatomy were particularly popular. Local women's groups also fed into larger cause-based and overtly political organizations. This is a local group from Petaluma that you see here, but they are involved in a WCTU function. You'll remember that's the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Women's suffrage, or the vote, was another issue which drew smaller women's groups together. So there was a huge overlap between clubs and social justice organizations. Nowhere was that crossover between so-called clubs and organized social justice action more clear than in Black women's clubs. The Black women's club movement emerged in the late 19th century and comprised a number of local reform organizations dedicated to racial betterment. Because of the constant pressure of white racism, Black women rarely had the luxury of having clubs purely for social reasons. Almost all clubs were also social justice organizations. These grassroots clubs were made up primarily of Black middle-class women who were part of the larger progressive reform effort, not beside it, part of it. Black women formed social organizations to provide concrete services, financial assistance, and moral guidance for the poor. Many of the groups grew out of religious and literary societies, which responded to the intensified racism in the late 19th century. And you can see 5 officers of the Women's League in Newport, Rhode Island in 1899 in this image. Although organizations existed all over the country, the largest number was concentrated in the Northeast. Black women involved in the club movement were generally well-educated, understood racially based poverty, studied healthcare, and possessed amazing organizing skills. The local groups were usually narrow in focus and supported things like homes for the aged, schools, and orphanages. All of this is very much in keeping with the reality that national laws were not going to help Black people. In Washington, D.C., the Black women's club movement was dominated by teachers who were concerned about the massive problems that faced Black children. In New York City, club women honored Ida B. Wells for her political activism to publicize the prevalence of lynching. This image here is from Iowa in 1903. And you might remember exodusters and other people who moved west. Like middle-class white women, middle-class Black women focused on helping the poor. But in this case, the basic premise was different. Most of these middle-class Black women felt that if white people saw educated, hardworking Black people, it would cause them to question their racism. That seems naive now, and you will see it called respectability politics, but it made perfect sense to women who honestly believed that Black people could affect the entrenched racism of the white American population. It was an action of hope. Black middle-class club women sought to teach the poor how to keep a household, manage a budget, and raise their children to fit into larger middle-class ideals in the hopes that they would be incorporated into the middle class as a whole. We know that it did not work, but it was not an unreasonable strategy on the part of the women who participated. Active club participants held conventions, conferences, and forums to engage the intellectual elite. In 1895, women organized at the local level made concerted attempts to develop national ties. The New Era Club in Boston began a publication, Women's Era, which covered local and national news of concern to Black club women. Two national federations of local clubs were formed in 1895, and the next year they merged to become the National Association of Colored Women, or NACW. At that point, we are looking at an organization with avowed larger national goals rather than local activists associated with clubs. So we will make the shift to the organization section of lecture, but noticing how seamlessly clubs graded into organizations. The National Association of Colored Women, from now on the NACW, took the motto, which they still have, lifting as we climb, to signify their hopes that if Black people changed, so would racism. As we know now, an unlikely prospect, since the issue of racism lay with white people. While it became clear that changing Black people was not going to change the white population committed to racism, the NACW was effective at the meeting place of civil rights with women's right to vote. Remember before, we saw working class factory women involved in the story of getting women's suffrage. Notice here that we see Black women involved in the struggle for women's suffrage. Mary Church Terrell, pictured on the slide here on the left, was both one of the founders of the NACW in 1896 and the organization's first president. Other founding members that you see on the right here included Harriet Tubman and, once again, I.W. Wells. Mary Church Terrell was born in 1863 during the American Civil War. Though both of her parents were born into slavery, they actually became one of the wealthy African American families in the U.S. who managed to weather racism to the extent that they stayed wealthy. As a result, Terrell received a very good education, including a degree from Oberlin College in Ohio that I drew your attention to earlier. Under Terrell, one of the NACW's major causes was women's right to vote. NACW members faced racism in the white suffrage movement, and Terrell sought to raise awareness of this among potentially sympathetic white suffragists. In a speech to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, or NAWSA, Terrell asked the white suffragists to, quote, stand up not only for the oppressed women, but also for the oppressed race. Unfortunately, while there were sympathetic white women, they were generally outnumbered by those who felt either that addressing racism would hinder their own fight for the vote, and even worse, those white women who based their right to vote on racism. The NACW still exists, and they have actually an extensive website if you're interested. I am going to introduce more organizations here, but not dwell on them. Many will show up in coming lectures, which is why I want to introduce them now so that you know how deep the roots are. The Niagara movement, and you see them pictured on the slide here, was developed in 1905 by a group including William Monroe Trotter and W.E.B. Du Bois, both of whom attended Harvard University. Trotter and Du Bois's mission was to develop a more forceful plan for fighting racial inequality. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, you might recognize that, was an outgrowth of the Niagara Movement and was established in 1909. I found that while many people are familiar with the work of the NAACP from the 1950s or at least the 1960s on, most do not realize that it was founded in the context of the Progressive Era. You will notice W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells here again. Now you know the context which Du Bois was experiencing before he published the book Black Reconstruction in 1935. And you might remember that the first reading you analyzed for your project discussed his book as a pivotal but much neglected work on American history. The National Urban League was established in 1910. This organization's mission was to end racial discrimination and to provide economic justice to African Americans who migrated from southern rural areas to northern cities, especially through the Great Migration, which we will get to in World War I. The National Urban League also still exists, and they also have a website if you want to check it out. I am going to end this incredibly long lecture here, but know that the famous middle-class white women's suffrage groups also formed in this progressive milieu, but it's easy to find material on those. Key points to Lecture 13. The U.S. federal government increased in size and complexity at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. This is because the nation itself was growing in every way: geographic size, population, industrialization, urbanization, and so on. Over this period, the white middle class grew in size, but also became hugely influential in politics. They formed an increasingly large, if not always consistent, voting bloc. The white middle class was defined by socioeconomic factors. Here, think both education and financial well-being. The white middle class at the turn to the 20th century saw a great deal that frightened or disturbed them in American society as a whole. However, different parts of the middle class disagreed on how to improve the situation. Civil service reform worked to put educated middle class men and women into federal jobs so that they could make a difference from their positions using notions of managerial science and efficiency. White evangelical Christians often felt that the poor were to blame for their own situation. This group favored anti-vice campaigns against things like alcohol consumption and sex work. Muckrakers were middle-class investigative journalists who tried to raise awareness of injustice among the white middle class through articles in newspapers and magazines. Muckrakers hoped that the white middle class as a group would then pressure politicians to make changes to help the working classes. At the national level, protective legislation really only took shape for issues affecting the white middle class fairly directly. For example, national food safety laws went through, whereas anti-lynching laws did not. Because of pervasive white racism, the Black middle class was defined more by education than by wealth. Most progressive changes that made a difference on the ground came at the level of local, municipal, and/or state governments responding to concentrated middle-class political and legal pressure. Some educated middle-class white women started settlement houses in an effort to help the working classes by living among them. Many early statistical studies on aspects of poverty came from settlement house residents. Women joined together to form clubs. Some of these were strictly social, while some were intellectual or involved in some sort of activism. Many blurred the lines by being all of these at the same time, and some even became involved with settlement houses. The work of Black club women was a critical part of both the early roots of the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement. Many of the organizations that will become crucial in civil rights activism in later lectures got their start in the first decades of the 20th century. These include the NACW and the NAACP. I am going for a one slide coda here because lecture 12 is so long. My research touches on women's classes in the gymnasium at Hull House. Among a number of activities, instructors under resident Rose Giles taught immigrant factory women basketball, competitive basketball. This proved so popular that by World War I, Hull House had two full competitive women's basketball teams, plus what was basically a JV team with younger members. And you can see reported in the newspaper on the sports page, not the women's page. Hull House, they do say girls, 25, Gads Hill 13. And in addition to reporting that Hull House won, they give credit to the lineup and the people who scored. I have given you this dress as our background, or rather a subtle detail from the dress, for a few reasons. The biggest reason I'm giving this to you is the length of the skirt. People often think that skirts suddenly got short only in the 1920s. This was not actually as out of the blue as that idea makes it seem. This dress is only 1910, and you can see that the hemline has already risen a fair bit here. Other things to notice are the delicacy of the fabric and the hand embroidery that you see. Despite that delicacy seeming formal to us, the midi blouse color, like a sailor color, and we've seen that on gym suits of the time, and the shorter skirts suggest something sporty as a leisure activity, like picnics with rowing or tennis or just running around.